So the first thing we need to do is to add in a script, and with code completion it dumps it in there and gets it ready to go for me quite quickly. So that's useful. Now the next thing that I want to do is I want to use JavaScript to grab a hold of one of the objects so that I know that I have accessed that object. And when I do that, we need to create a variable to reference that object. So we are going to create our variable by using the word const, short for constant. So generally when we're creating variables in JavaScript, using modern JavaScript, so we're going to be using let and const instead of the keyword var. Older versions of JavaScript we would just use var for all of our variables, but now we're going to use let and const. Good practice is use const for declaring your variables unless you know that that variable needs to change what you're assigning to it or change its content, and then you would use let. And how do you know the difference? Use const, and then if you get an error message in your code, that means, oh, I'll change it to let. And then you just change it to let and you're good to go. So get in the habit of just always using const when you declare a variable. So in this case, I am going to create a variable constant. I'll call it first because I'm going to gain access to an element on my page that has the ID of first. So I'll say const first is equal to document dot query selector, and then inside of parentheses, inside of quotes, I am going to reference that element. Now, a couple things about this. I used single quotes here. JavaScript, in most instances, does not care whether you use single quotes or double quotes. But notice these are quotes. These are the vertical dashes right next to the return key on the keyboard. That is different than under the escape key. You have what's called the back tick mark. So we can see the difference in the back tick mark where it's angled. There is a time in modern JavaScript ES6 where we actually use back tick marks instead of using single quotes. So know that those are not the same. Single quotes are not the same as back ticks. You can see the visual indicator. They are different entities. So sometimes if you're copying code from some other source, you won't realize that they very subtly are using backticks instead of single quotes, and you'll be like, why is my code not working? And your console gives you error messages and you're like, I don't get it. Oh, so look close on that. To avoid that, you could always just use double quotes instead, and that's fine. In a lot of my examples, I will use single quotes or double quotes depending on what my fingers hit on the keyboard, just because that's how it works. It allows us and sometimes wants us to have a semicolon at the end of our line of code, but doesn't require it in most cases. So I have gotten out of the habit of using a semicolon at the end of my lines in a lot of the coding that I do. That doesn't make it right or wrong. There are some style guides that say you should always still use a semicolon because JavaScript hasn't cared about the semicolon almost forever. But it's up to you to decide whether you want to use it or not. So I will probably not do it in most of the code going forward unless I have to put a semicolon in, just because I won't put one there. But if you like the semicolon because it makes your lines of code feel complete, go nuts. So what this does is I have now created a variable called first, and it's accessing inside my document an element that has the ID of first. If I want to access this button, I would grab the element with the ID of click me, which is what we're going to do next. So I've accessed this item here. So now I'm going to access click me. And as I do this, you will notice that the name that I am using here under click me corresponds exactly to my variable name. Now, there are some times in some cases where you will want your variable name to be different than the ID name that you're using to gain access to an object. But ultimately, I find it's easier if all those names line up so that when I look at it, I know exactly what it corresponds to. I used to, early on, I didn't like using the same name for my JavaScript variable as the ID name on the object because I thought then that seemed confusing. Now I find it confusing if it's not the same name. So that's why I will use that as well. So I have access to this item here, and currently my page is live refreshing inside the browser. So if I jump over to my browser, we can see there it is. Now, one thing that's useful when we start doing our JavaScript is we want to pull up the JavaScript console so we can find out if we have any error messages happening within our document. Because if it's breaking, we want to know that. And we can do that by going under View, Developer, JavaScript Console. Now that pulls up the console over here. We can see our window is squished because it's set to 80% out of fixed size. And now I have the console showing up. Now, if I had an error inside my JavaScript, so I'll just insert an error by making it wrong. If I go back over here, I can see that it's now showing an error in the console. So when I load my page, if I start trying to click on things and my JavaScript doesn't appear to be working, I'm like, what is wrong? Why is this broken? Well, pull up the console. The JavaScript goes, hey, guess what? At line 66, there's a problem. Because I'm looking in the console, it's telling me line 66 has an issue. So I go back over here and go, line 66. Oh, look, I'm missing the letter E. I can now save that, go back here, and it goes away. So now that I have access to these elements, so if I look up in my HTML, I can see that first, here's the section, and it has this ID attached to it. There's a paragraph within it. There's a button within it. So I gained access to the button. I've gained access to the first element itself. But if I wanted to gain access to that paragraph inside of that section, I would have to do things a little bit different. It works to gain access to an element in CSS where we say, I want this ID, then the paragraph within that. We can even do that within our JavaScript. So if I want to grab the first paragraph of first, document, query, selector, first P, that is now going to gain access to that element. So we can now gain control of it. So the first thing that we're trying to do here within the JavaScript is to access objects in our DOM, our document object model. So we're trying to make JavaScript go, hey, I know what you are. Because once we know what it is, we can start changing its properties. We can modify properties of it. Now that first paragraph has a property of the text within it. So we can change the text within that particular paragraph if we want. So we could just change it directly when the page loads. By simply saying first P dot inner HTML is equal to what did it say to begin with? Hi. So I'm just going to put some text there. How are you? Now, I'm pulling my window down so I can see both at the same time, because you can see that's what it looks like. It says hi, but when I save the page is going to reload. The JavaScript is going to go grab that text, and then it's going to repaint that text with the new text content. And we can see how it now just updated that text on screen. So JavaScript is changing the text. If I look at the HTML for my page, I will see, as far as my web browser is concerned, the actual text HTML on this page in that paragraph is, how are you? But if I look at the actual code, we will see that it says hi. So JavaScript grabbed that element in my DOM and then changed its text content to be something else. JavaScript grabs the objects on screen, well, 3 of them so far, and then it's rewriting the contents of one of those objects. But we don't really care too much about that, so we can just leave that there, and we'll just add some more stuff in. So what we want to add in here, I'm just going to pull this up so it's a little easier to see on screen. So what we want to add in is we want to be able to tell that button to listen for someone clicking on it. And this is click me. We want to say, why don't we listen? And we're going to use add event listener. So click me, add event listener, and the event that we're listening for is a click. And when we click the button, we want it to call a function that we are going to create. Now, a function is just a contained set of instructions. So it's a set of instructions that we don't want to have our program do anything with until we call that function. So the function is, we want to do something, but don't do it until I tell you to do that. And then when I tell you to do it, do whatever that thing is that I wanted you to do. So functions are a way to have delayed gratification. Because currently, when I change the inner HTML, the text of that first paragraph, that was immediate gratification because it happened right away. But when I'm using a function, that's going to be delayed gratification. So it's not going to happen. Those events won't take place until I press the button. So I use the keyword function to designate that I'm writing a function. Then I put the name of my function, follow that by some parentheses. Now we put E in here. Anytime we're doing a click function, we probably are going to want to know who clicked it, so we need to track that E. E is going to be the event. It'll make more sense as we'll get into event functions in much greater detail in coming projects. So don't worry too much about it right now. We're just putting it in there out of habit because we'll be referencing it down the road. So this way we know that this is an event function. So E stands for event. But the word event is a reserved word, so I don't want to actually write out the word event there. So sometimes people, instead of using E, will maybe use EVT, short for event. I just use E. So that's what I'm going to stick with. I've been using E for too long to do something else that would break all of my coding if I tried to use something other than E. So E is going to be the event that happened, which was a click. That's what it stands for. So I have word function, the name of my function, parentheses with an E in it, and some curly braces. Now inside these curly braces, this is where the magic is going to happen. The magic is the instructions of what this function is going to do. We're going to make it really impressive in the beginning here. We're going to just send a message to the console. So I click the button and we'll see something show up in the console and say, hey, I was clicked. Hey, I was clicked. And I really wasn't joking when I said it's going to send a message that says, hey, I was clicked. So if I click that button, it's going to send a message over to my console, and it will say, hey, I was clicked. Now I'm going to jump over into my other document here. I'm going to go back into the console so I can see what's there. We can see it. I did get my immediate gratification. Hey, how are you? Now if I click my click me button, it now put that message into the console. Hey, I was clicked. Click it again. We can see now every time I click, it's just adding a new version of that. So now that we have some basic stuff working here, I'm going to repeat this a little bit, and I'll say drink me.add event listener. Click drink me function, and then we'll say function drink me function e couple curly braces console.log. Hey, I might be drunk. Okay. So now if I save that, go back here and run this, and all right, let's see if I click here. I'm like, hey, it's kind of working here. For right now, let's just assume that in most cases, if we want to change the properties of an element, we need to create a variable that references that element. So by creating a variable drinkme that references the drinkme button, and then that drinkme button is listening for a click, which we'll call the drinkme function. The drinkme function logs out to the console and says, hey, I might be drunk. So let's just right now agree that the better way of working is to have a variable reference to any object we are trying to manipulate in the DOM. Even if JavaScript does seem to have some cases where it will access an element that has an ID on it, and our variable or our reference in our code is to that element's ID. So click me, drink me, they're both kind of doing some different things here. Now if we look at click me where it's logging out to the console and says, hey, I was clicked, we could just as easily go through and realize that our first paragraph, first P, we could change its inner HTML when we click the button to reference something. So I can just put in its inner HTML, I'll say ouch. Now if I look here, oh, hang on. Messing around with things, I got rid of the P, so I changed the inner HTML or the content of first, which is the section, not the paragraph, to how are you, which then wiped the button out of that particular element. So now I put that back to first P instead of first. So now my button is back. And now if I click here, it responds by changing the text within my window. The next thing that I want to do, so I've grabbed my first section, I've grabbed the paragraph within that. I am going to grab the paragraph in the second one so I can change that around. So I'll grab second P, that will be equal to document.querySelector, and the selector is going to be second P, second space P. So I'm grabbing that paragraph that's in my second section with the ID of second. So I'm grabbing that. Now that we've grabbed that second P, we're going to work with that. And since that happens to exist inside the item with the drink me button, I think then we're going to play around with that one a little bit more. And instead of just logging to the console, it would be way more fun if we could log to our text itself on the page, because most people don't have the console open. So I will grab my second P, and I will change its inner HTML, and we'll set that equal to, and it starts out where in the, we look at it, it says I am. So I'm going to change that a little bit and say, because if we're drinking something, we may be drunk. All right, now if I save that, look over here, pull up the console. It's always a good idea to keep the console up constantly while you're working on your JavaScript, because if you cause any errors, you immediately see it. Otherwise, you'll do something, start clicking around, it's not working, keep changing your code without ever knowing if you're changing the right thing. Now, if I click here, we can see it changes. I want to modify this a little bit, so I don't want to just change it to drunk. I want to add to it. So I want to add this. Every time I click, it's going to, instead of replacing what was there, it's going to add to what was there by using plus equals. So if I use equals, it just changes what's being assigned to it. If I use plus equals, it adds, it keeps what was there and adds more to it. So now when I save this and look at it, it says I am, if I click the button, drunk. And now if I keep clicking the button, we'll see that it keeps putting it in. We have something happening with the first part of this here. I want to go into doing something a little bit different, and that's modifying the class that is assigned to something. So if I go back up here and look at my second section, which has the I am statement in it, we'll see that it has a class assigned to it of green. And what I want to do is I want to change the class that is assigned to this from green to red. So if I click on this button, oh, not clan name, it's not Scottish. Our class name, I will set that equal to red. So when I click the Drink Me button, it is going to change the class name from green to red. Now, as I look at this, it's going to be more fun to watch it, not just to see the result there, but to also see, as I look at the HTML here, I can see there's my second section. It currently has a class of green. So if I go up and click the button, we will see where green has now been changed and goes to red. So while I'm using the console, I can use the console not just to look for JavaScript errors, but when I'm doing DOM manipulations. So I'm changing HTML elements, changing HTML contents, changing classes assigned to objects. If I have the DOM up, I can visually see exactly what is happening for how my browser is now rendering my page. So if I refresh the page and look, we can see that the class on that element is currently green, but when I click the button, we'll see when I click the button, I want its class name to switch to red. So I click the button, green becomes red, and we can see that it is indeed happening with the visual effect. So I am going to create a constant for a third. Set that equal to document.querySelector third. Okay, so now that gave me access to the third section here. The third section has a background color on it. Now, what we can do here is I can say third.add event listener. Oh, not address. Click. And this will be third click function. Now, the name that you assign to your functions should be representative of what it's doing. It should not just be some random name. Don't be afraid to put multiple words together so it becomes representative of it. And if you notice, I'm using the word function in the function name. You don't have to do that, but based on what we're doing here where we have a lot of the same names repeating, I find that helps me to mentally keep straight what that element is going to be. So the first thing that I'm going to do just is to log out log out 3 if I click on that third element just to see. So I can now save this. And now voila, let's go back to the console. So I'm clicking in the text, clicking anywhere within the purple. We can see that it is going. Now, from a usability standpoint, I may want to set it up so that it does not turn to the I-beam and allow me to select the text within that. So it's just clickable if this was something that's more production oriented. But we can see whether I click on the text or the basic background, it is logging out that 3. Happening here, I'll see that I've now taken my element, I've accessed its style property directly. I'm changing its background color, the CSS background color of that element, and it will go from purple to pink. Now, if I'm just going to force a reload here. So when I go back to the page, it's purple. If I click within that third element, it now changed it to a pink color. So I've modified a direct style property. So I can do that, or I can modify a class property. In this case, I'm now assigning the class to that text paragraph only instead of changing the class name of the whole. So if I get rid of the P, it changes it to all of it. So class name is one way we can do it. Now what this does is it obliterates whatever class name was present on that object and removes any classes and replaces it with that new class. There's another way that we can, and I'm going to just comment that out and going to set something up a little bit different. So what we can do is we can say if second contains, oh, sorry, I forgot a word in there. Second's class list dot contains green is equal to true. And I'm going to go character by character through this in a moment. So something that we can do inside of JavaScript is we can ask questions. And these questions, the computer is incapable of doing much more at its base level than simply providing yes, no answers or true, false. Computers like to think in terms of 0, 1, yes, no, true, false. That's how they operate. So with this, we're asking the question of the computer. We're going to say, hey, does the class list on second, does it have green in it? And if that's true, what we want to do is to get rid of green and add in red. Because then, if it doesn't contain green, then we want to add in green and add red. So I'm going to make it so when I click on the button, it just keeps switching between green, red, green, red, green, red. So we're going to be adding and removing. So we can say second dot class list dot remove. So if it contains green, we want to get rid of green. And then second dot class list add red. So if it has green on it, which when the page loads, it does, we're going to remove green and add in red. Else, so what we do is we use an if-else statement. So if something is true, do what we were telling it to do. Else, do this other stuff. So computers like to do this. Now, a lot of the programming that we can do can be very straightforward. It's just we grab elements of the DOM, we attach event listeners to things, and we do our delayed gratification functions that when that event happens, we do something. But often we want our programs to be a little bit more introspective. We want them to think. We want them to analyze what the situation is and act accordingly. So now, if it doesn't contain green, that means we want to add in green. Not green. Don't want to get greedy here. And then we'll say second class list.remove red. And we know we can remove red because we know how the program started. We know that it started out with green. So the very first time through, we knew that this had to be true, so we're going to get rid of green and add red. The next time I click the button, we're going to look and say, hey, look, green's not there. So we're going to add green and remove red. So we're going to just keep doing that process over and over. And when we do that, now I can click on the button and it will keep switching green, red, until the cows come home. Moving into file 30, entering text. A couple of things about it. So we have some display properties here. DN is for display, setting the CSS display property to none. So we can set the properties to visible, to hidden, to none. All of these have different properties or effects on how things work within the page. My 3 divs, I'm throwing in different background colors into them. So, 3 IDs, not divs. So we can see we have an input, an output, and then 3 paragraphs. So when I look at the page here, input, and then this section down here is my output, and there's 3 paragraphs that are occurring within that. Moving into the JavaScript. We'll come back to some of the stuff that I just blew past over there. So we have querySelector. It grabs the input and output. We grab the button. We put a event listener on the button. Now, one thing we'll see is I have click, my click handler for the function name for the button. There is this comma false after it. And it seems that that used to be recommended. There's a rationale for putting in false for the third parameter on event listeners. Most examples these days with ESX seem to be skipping on that. So we're not putting it in anymore. It used to be just put it in on every event listener and change it to true in the cases where you realize your code is breaking and you need to change it to true. And when that's occurring, you would know why. Now, the practice that everyone seems to be following is just skip it in its entirety, and it works just fine without putting in the comma false. Now, if we put our event listeners in and it breaks and we run into problems, then we add back in the comma false. So we realize when we're doing something and it's not working right, then we will Google for a solution and invariably find that, oh, we do need that optional parameter. So for right now, if you have the third parameter, so most of the functions with event listeners in the sample file still include comma false. If you delete them, it's working just fine without, so we'll get rid of that. So some more query selectors. We're also setting the cursor style of the button to pointer so that when I put the mouse over the button, we will see that the cursor changes to the hand. Now, this is a property that would be a desktop-only property or a pointing device property. If I'm using a mobile device with the touch screen, we don't have a cursor property because all we have is where do I touch. So we don't change that cursor. But it's a nice to have when we're doing desktop work so that we know what is a clickable element. So that's a nice to have, highly recommended. Now, if I look here, we'll see input. So my input is going to be, there's my input that we did a query selector on. And in the beginning, we set the input to have focus. So what that means is when the page loads, the cursor is automatically inserted into that field. I don't have to click on it to start typing. I can start typing right away in this window, and it automatically is receiving my input. If I get rid of that focus and save my page, reload, we can see how I have to click into it before I can start typing. So that's a nice property to have on your pages. If you have a form field, set it up where you set the focus for the first form field you want people to fill out on your page. If the form is the primary thing, so if you set up a contact form on a web page and you want that contact form where they get to start typing on it right away and you want that focus to be directed to that so they don't have to click in it, set the focus of that form field. That would be the preferred usability feature to include on your page. If you have a form at the very bottom of the page, so someone's going to be scroll down, and at the very end it's like input field for subscribe to our website, you don't want to put a focus on that because that's going to then take the focus away and people will be like, I'm trying to do stuff and where'd my cursor go? Oh, it's in that form field down 3 scroll screens below. Bad form. Don't do that. Continuing on within this, now blur says, okay, I click on the button, it takes the input away from that. So focus makes it the kind of the active item. Blur removes that focus away from it. That's what blur does. And if you forget, you're like, what's this blur thing on here? Hop into your web browser, JS space blur comes up, you'll be like, oh, blur removes focus away from that element. Oh yeah. What I really am after in this particular example is this part right here. So notice we say output. The inner HTML for my output is going to be the value of my input. So if we go and figure out what was output, so I have a paragraph right here that has nothing in it right now. I'm even going to just put I am junk in it so that we can see that something was there. If I go back to my page and reload this page, we'll see here's a paragraph. There's output. It says I am junk. If I type some text and hit enter, it got filled with that. You'll also notice that a couple things just disappeared. If I go back over here, I'll see that I set the class name for first to DN and the class name for second to DN. If I remember through all of this in my style what DN is, the class of DN is display none. That's why those two elements disappeared from my screen. Going into the starting file for the Mad Libs, I'm going to look at the JavaScript here a little bit to notice got a bunch of query selectors going on. Some event listeners. And again, if you want to delete false, you can do that. But when I click submit button, it's going to call the write function story, or the write story function. So scrolling down, we'll see that some of these things we probably don't need quite yet. But let's see, write story. It says grab the input values to write the story. So let's see, my input values currently, I have first name, favorite color, and place. And then the story is going to be this paragraph here. Currently the word is junk in there. So if we look at this, we could maybe try something like let story be equal to, we'll just start out with, actually we'll start with in the beginning let's see, we have what, is it name? Yeah, name, color, place. In the beginning, space, like this. Then story plus equals first name dot value now the story dot inner HTML is going to be equal to story. So I created a variable. Now I've added to it, and now I've changed the HTML of the paragraph element, which has the ID of the story. Pop this open in the browser. Name, red, beach. Hit submit. And we can see that it now populated that text on screen.
Why don't you use browser plus?
I have story plus equals. Oh, fave color. I forgot one thing here. Dot value. I want to grab the value of that element. Then story plus equals. So we can do plus equals as many times as we want. But because we're changing the value of story, it can't be a constant in it. We have to use let to define our variable. So now when I save it, reload the page, and we'll see. But if I notice here, it did not space things out. So now red shirt became one word. But if I go back and look at my JavaScript, I will see I have favorite color plus, and then I need to put a space before the word shirt.